1 Edward 1029, copy, threatening traffic.
Copy, moving route.
Edward 1029, if you can please respond to 2020 McNeil Street, Lake.
Copy. If you still have run on, give the ATO information first.
Welcome to Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey. I'm Brad Carlyon, your Navajo County attorney, and my normal partner, Sheriff Casey Clark, couldn't be with us for this show today, but he sent his Chief Deputy Jim Melessa to fill in for him. Today, our guests are Judge Michaela Rickel and Navajo County Victim Services Director Roxanne Padilla. And what we're going to be talking about is the Navajo County Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. What exactly is the Domestic Fatality Review Team?
Well, the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board is a board that consists of several different service providers, people who would be working with domestic violence victims here in Navajo County. To name a few of the agencies that are represented on our board, we have members of law enforcement, we have Superior Court representatives like Judge Rickel, we have the probation department, we have advocates from local shelters, including victim services and prosecutors on board, people from community counseling centers and probation departments. They're all represented there. And what we do is we look at a local case, so a domestic violence fatality review, or a domestic violence fatality that occurred here in Navajo County, and we try to obtain as much information on that case as possible, not just about the incident, but about the people and all of the parties involved. And then we develop a timeline and we really scrutinize the details of the family's history, and we look at the services that were provided to these families, to the defendants, through different sources, through services provided to the victims also, and we see where we can implement changes and maybe create new resources available to victims of domestic violence to help those incidences not increase to the level of a fatality.
All right, you threw out a lot of information, Roxanne. Let's break it down. So what's the primary purpose that this board, this team is looking at?
We are looking at domestic violence situations and how to prevent those from increasing to a level of a fatality.
So these are actual victims, and then what the chemistry was between those victims, and then what caused them to have some sort of government interaction, either through law enforcement, through the seeking of like orders of protections or something like that involve the courts. So how all these things come together, and then how the different organizations work with each other or don't work with each other, right?
Correct. There's a no shame, no blame policy for all of the members on this board, and that's why it's important to have the people who are actually providing the services represented there. We want to look at the services we're providing and see, are they really working? And if they're not, what can we do to correct those services that are currently being provided? What changes can we implement? If we needed to start doing something or modify the way we're doing it, we have these people on board to help create that type of change.
And it's not just government entities that's a part of this. Don't we have members of the public, the faith-based community, counseling services, things of that nature?
We do. We have all of those involved. We also have the medical examiner, we have healthcare authorities, all who've been invited to the table. Because again, what we're looking at these tragedies with the objective, obviously, of keeping further tragedies from occurring.
Sure.
So we're looking at a systematic issue and saying systematically, are there things that we can change overall to make things better and to make things less likely to happen again?
Yeah, I know we've talked domestic violence on this show before, but not domestic violence fatalities. Are there many cases in Navajo County where domestic violence ends up in a fatality?
If I may.
Yeah.
There are actually more than what you might think. Especially if we look at Navajo County as a whole, including both reservations. I was reading a study that just came out in 2014 that was built upon all the reports that all the domestic violence review boards are putting together. And it was for 2013. And for example, in 2013, there were 125 deaths that were domestic violence related fatalities throughout the state, 4 of which were in Navajo County. It just so happened that particular year, none of them were within the jurisdiction of the state courts. However, they are occurring, and so we need to be aware of them. One other thing, when I was reading the study, that somewhat surprised me, because we tend to think of domestic violence fatalities as being intimate partner fatalities. In fact, in 2013, looking at the 4 that were in Navajo County, one of them was violence between intimate partners. The other ones included sibling violence, child on parent, and parent on child. And that is somebody else that we also have at the table is DCS, formerly CPS. We've got a representative from that agency as well.
So it's fair to say one of the takeaways was, in a situation like domestic violence, regardless of the participants, the entities in the community, law enforcement, courts, county attorney, everybody has a role to play. And the fallacy, if law enforcement has a failing or courts have a failing or something like that, that drags down the rest of the system too, which ultimately affects the end consumer, right?
Right, the safety of those who might be victims of domestic violence.
How long has the Navajo County Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team been in place?
Well, we were officially a board in 2010, but we began our first case study in 2013, and we have recently concluded that. I'm in the process of completing a report that I'll submit to the Attorney General's office. In fact, this week, it's due on the 31st of July, and we are reviewing our second case.
So how long does it take to do this review? You talked about developing a timeline, getting as much documentation as you can and other information on that fatality. So how long does it take, and what do you do?
It can take a while. We've tried a couple of different processes of doing it. Originally we tried meeting once a month, and we would get as much material as we can, and then we met together and tried to determine how much more material we needed and from what agencies. Then we got that material together, and then we tried to come up with a timeline, and so we utilized a timeline with all the information that we could have. For example, in our first case, it included as far back as juvenile records. So we went back decades and tried to look at what situations occurred and what problems occurred in both the violator and the victim's family and their services that they had utilized, so that we could try to see what helped, what might have helped more, what other options there were. So we do all that, we get it all together in a long timeline, and then we start looking for red flags for things that we think we can improve on as a system.
And then we had some outside assistance as far as mentoring us through this process. Who was that?
That was Stephanie Mayer. She is currently working with the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative team. Neil Webstill, he heads that coalition, and they're located in Flagstaff. And she would come down to all of our meetings, and she helped us through our very first case review.
Right.
And then you said you changed procedures for that second case review instead of meeting monthly. How did you try on the second one?
We decided, because everybody is volunteering their time to this cause, that we wanted to make the review work within everybody's schedule the best that we could, and that a month between each case review, sometimes we would get busy in our everyday jobs, and we would forget material, and we spent a lot of time recapping where we were and where we left off. So now we are meeting for 2 days, 2 solid days in a row, and we'll meet about every 6 months.
Okay. If I remember, the first case was an incident that occurred east of Snowflake, and you guys reviewed that. What came out of it? What did you guys see as changes that we need to look at in our system from that first one?
Well, one of the things I think that came out early on is that even as professionals, we may know our job and we may know our resources, but we may not know the other resources in the community. So for example, if somebody came up to me as we were walking out of the studio and said, I'm a victim of domestic violence, where do I go? I could help them with how to get to the court system, how to get to the police. But I don't have numbers in my head for community counseling center, for, I know that there are safe houses. I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head how to get to them or who to call. So we started realizing that if we don't know this information, what are the chances that those needing the information have them? Sure. And so we started looking, one of the first things that we looked at is how do we make sure that we have a cohesive way to get information to those who are in desperate need?
And what was your solution?
Well, we developed a brochure, and I have to give credit to the White Mountain Safe House because they are actually the creators of the brochure, and Brad Carlyon, who helps fund the printing of these. I presented these at the Chief of Police meeting, and these brochures have a lot of local information. It has telephone numbers, it has the power of control wheel, safety planning, tips, and a risk assessment inside. But it does, the main thing is it has all of the phone numbers for any agency or service provider in Navajo County that a domestic violence victim might need when they're trying to seek assistance or get help. And law enforcement, when they meet with domestic violence victims at the crime incident, they will be presenting these to those victims at that time.
Besides having law enforcement give it to a victim at a scene, do we have ways that we're getting these out into the communities for those who may be victims that haven't been touched by law enforcement yet?
Well, the shelters have copies of these brochures. I have copies of these brochures, so when I do meet with victims, I hand those out as well. And anytime I go to do outreach, I am providing these to any members of the community that are willing to have them and present these to victims. I think it's nice to have something just specific to Navajo County that has all of the resources at a victim's fingertips.
And one thing that's nice about this program, certainly if there are any listeners who can see themselves as somebody who could present these or to carry these, and they think, oh, I see a lot of domestic violence victims, I should have some of those brochures, that perhaps they can get a hold of Roxanne, because our real goal is to get this out to the public. One of the other things that we're aware of is even having these in your hands, in your possession, may be problematic for some people who are victims of domestic violence. If the perpetrator comes home and sees this could be problematic. So another thing that we're looking at is trying to do additional public outreach, public information, maybe through radio, through programs such as this, so we can get the information out in a place where they can hear it and hopefully be able to retain it, so they at least have a starting point for the future. One of the important things I think on here is the risk assessment questions, and so we're hoping to get those out so that people, as they're driving, can either say, oh, you know what, I am at risk. I need to start really thinking about the risk that I'm at. And maybe even some of the people who are perpetrators are going, you know what, that sounds kind of like me. I never thought of myself as a perpetrator, but it's time for me to get help before they get into a situation where violence actually occurs.
And then using those risk assessment questions, I know within our office, and I know Pine Top Lakeside, who was a guest last session, we've used those to change our reporting requirements in concert with the county attorney's office. So if the victim doesn't feel that they're in an environment that's going to have the propensity for more violence, we in law enforcement can help forecast that with the assistance of the county attorney's office, and then make everybody aware that you're in a potentially dangerous situation here.
And my office can prioritize what cases to really put a lot of effort into. Besides these brochures and the awareness that we need to get out more information to the public, to potential victims on resources they have in the community, what other things came out of that very first Fatality Review Board?
One thing that we had also discovered is that one of the tools that domestic violence victims most commonly utilize are orders of protection. And those, when a victim's in trauma, so when they're going to obtain those orders of protection, they're getting a lot of information thrown at them, and they're not retaining that. They're not able to retain that information. So having an advocate available on call to assist victims while getting an order of protection would be highly valuable to them. They have a contact number, a face, somebody to call in the future. Not only that, but they can be explained the rules and how to properly utilize an order of protection, other than having the judge explain that to them in that moment of crisis.
So for some of the viewers that may not know where or how an order of protection comes about, where does that process start?
Well, there's different ways that you can get an order of protection. The one that's probably utilized most often is with the justice courts. The justice courts can issue orders of protection. There's no fee to file a petition for an order of protection. If there are children in common and they are part of the order of protection, sometimes they're part of the order of protection, sometimes they're not, but if they are part of the order of protection, they may send you to Superior Court because we have authority over both the adults and the children in that realm. So sometimes then they send you to Superior Court so you can get them from Superior Court. If it's an emergency situation and they're not court hours, you can also get them through the police departments.
So what exactly is an order of protection?
An order of protection is an order which says that the defendant is not to go near the plaintiff and or other parties listed in the order of protection. So basically it puts them on notice. You may not go within at or near these people. So our goal is to keep people who otherwise might be abusers away from the victim as a first line of defense. The reality is, and I tell people that, it's a document. So you still have to take the proper precautions. You still have to, if you're concerned, contact law enforcement. But it's a starting point, and also it tells law enforcement, I understand this is the person's home, however, they're not allowed to go to this facility, they're not allowed to go to this school, they're not allowed to go to this place of business. So we can try to isolate the victim at least until the proper services are in place.
You talked about getting victim advocates started interacting with these victims at the time. Have we taken any steps to do that? And if so, how? And how does that work?
Well, we have developed a call list that we are going to be dispersing and providing to the Superior Courts and all of the local justice courts. In Winslow, the Winslow Justice Court, they would be calling their local shelter Alice's Place. The Holbrook Justice Court can utilize our Victim Services Department located at the County Attorney's Office, or also the North Country Domestic Violence Counselor. Through Snowflake Justice Court, Pine Top, and Show can utilize the Safe House, the White Mountain Safe House advocates that are on call. And also Victim Services can respond if need be. We're the secondary point of contact to any of those justice courts and Superior Court to an advocate when they are available. We will be dispersing that out within the next couple of weeks.
Excellent. Were there other things that came out of this very first one, or were those the primary two that your team has been focusing on to implement as you continue to work on this next fatality that you're reviewing?
I think one of the other issues, and we haven't been able to solve it, but one of the other issues that came about is there's still such a negative connotation with getting counseling services, both for victims and for perpetrators. And so people tend to try to stay away from counseling services sometimes, or they don't fully engage in them. And so that's certainly something that we would ultimately like to get addressed, so that people understand that, sort of the no shame thing, that it's okay to go. If you know you need help, go get the help, both to make you stronger as a victim or to get help so that you don't escalate into these situations that we've had to review, because they're horrible. They change people's lives forever, and there's no going back. So if we can get people into counseling and utilizing counseling and talking about it, we're hoping that ultimately we can eradicate it for this generation, and what we know that would mean would be to address future generations, because this tends to be a generational problem.
When you're talking about counseling, Judge, maybe you're talking about a holistic approach in addition to anger management, maybe some sort of a substance abuse going on as well, other contributing factors where we can bring those resources into to help them deal with the situation that's causing the domestic violence.
Absolutely. In the 2 cases that we've studied so far, it's believed that substance abuse has been an issue in both of those cases, and I suspect we're going to find as we go through this process that it's rampant in those situations.
As we know in the criminal justice system, we see it in almost all the crimes, so it's not surprising it's an active role in domestic violence too. So where are you guys in the process of your second case that you're analyzing?
We've almost completed our timeline. The timeline takes up the majority of this, I think, the time for the case review. We are still trying to obtain information that we would like to include in our timeline before we start looking and identifying red flags and considering implementable recommendations that we can actually enforce or have be part of our regular curriculum when working with domestic violence victims.
So how long does it take you to go through a case? A full year? Meeting once a month or a couple days a month?
Yeah, a full year. And a full year would be probably on the faster side. Some boards, according to what Stephanie had told me, can take up to 2 years to complete a case study. And we take a very serious look. We try to obtain as much information as possible that we can, and that can take some time.
And does that include trying to bring people who played a role in the matter to talk and share their thoughts, feelings, and insights?
Yes, we look at who we think can maybe have some insight, as you pointed out, into the situation and see if they're interested in speaking to us. Of course, they're not required to, but as we're trying to get as much information as possible, we would certainly like to hear from those who are closest to the situation and might be able to say, if I had known X, Y might have happened. So I think that gives us a little more insight into where we proceed for the future. All the information that we receive is confidential, and it's confidential by statute. The local Arizona statute, not that it really matters, is ARS 41-198, and it specifically says that all this information that we receive is confidential, so that we can make sure that no one, everybody feels free to come in and tell us what they need to.
Very much is a learning environment, so as like a law enforcement manager, I can hear from the very victim what took place, what shortfalls maybe our office did or didn't do. And then we can fix that with, like this pamphlet being one of the fixes, the propensity for violence being one of the fixes, so we can minimize this.
Yeah. Roxanne, one of the things you mentioned is there's a national institute that helps to organize this. So this sounds like something going on across the nation, and I assume across Arizona too?
Yes, several counties have a domestic violence fatality review board similar to ours. Almost all of them at this point, but we are very glad to join that particular initiative and be able to look at the crimes that are actually happening here locally and develop ways to improve our services.
And I assume we look at the reports from the other, especially rural counties in Arizona, that may share some of the resource issues that we have, to see what they've identified and what they've implemented, and maybe utilize some of their ideas locally, I assume.
Yes, that's one thing that we do. Also, I try to encourage to not even think, because our resources are limited in smaller counties, we tend to think, well, what is there that we can provide to victims that we can utilize within the resources available to us? But because this report is being submitted to the Attorney General's office, I like to think big too. What can happen? What can the Attorney General's office see in connection to all of the counties? Things that are occurring, can there be, state legislative changes as a result of those? So we try to think in both ways.
Well, we're out of time, so I'd like to thank both of you, Judge and Roxanne. Thank you very much
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you
for joining with us, and thank you for joining us on this edition of Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey, and we hope you'll join us again next month.